and physiologists. This video is from chapter 25 from our book. It's all about the urinary system. This video, we're talking about urinary system anatomy. Our goal for this lecture series are to talk about the urinary system. So we're going to talk about gross anatomy, microanatomy, but we also want to understand the structure and the function of the nephron. The nephron is the functional thing of the kidneys, the thing that does the kidney's job. And we're going to talk about the process of making urine. We're also going to talk about the controls for urine, how concentrated it is, how much there is. We'll talk about that. And then lastly, we'll understand how urine is transported, how it's stored, and how we eliminate it. This is an overview of the urinary system. So the urinary system consists of the kidneys. We have two of them. So each of these guys, that's the kidney. Remember, we learned about the adrenal glands before. This is atop the kidneys. Also part of the urinary system are the ureters, these two tubes that come down from the kidneys. Also is the urinary bladder, or just the bladder. That's where urine is stored. And then lastly, urine exits the urinary system out the urethra. The kidneys are retroperitoneal, which means they're behind that peritoneum. Notice that we're looking at a frontal view here, but things like the stomach, the liver, all the intestines, all of that stuff is removed here. Because the kidneys, they're kind of located on more of like the backside of the body, retroperitoneal. So all of these structures work to perform the common function of the urinary system, which is formation, storage, elimination of urine. The most important part of the urinary system for this job is the kidneys, because they perform a lot of jobs, and we'll talk about some of them here. So the kidneys act, I think if I were to describe the kidneys in one word, I think of like a filter. It helps regulate the contents of water and ions in the body. So here's some stuff that the kidneys do, and I'll just kind of write it to the side here. So the kidneys, they do a lot of jobs. They regulate, so this is the kidneys. Regulate volume of water. They regulate the concentration of solutes. The concentration of solutes, which are the things that exist in the water, it has a special name, especially when we talk about the kidneys. This is an important one to know. It's called osmolality. The amount of stuff in the water. And we'll get more into that when we get to the physiology. The kidneys, they also regulate the concentration of ions, especially when it comes to the ECF, extracellular fluid. It aids in acid-base balance. The kidneys help us get rid of metabolic wastes. So those byproducts of metabolism that we don't need, then we just get rid of it. And also things like toxins, things like drugs. All of that can be eliminated in the kidneys. The kidneys also make hormones. There's two. There's erythropoietin. That's the one we called EPO. Aids in red blood cell formation. And also renin, which plays a role in blood pressure regulation, which we talked about in the cardiovascular system. So we regulate stuff, acid-base balance, get rid of stuff, make some hormones, and then we also can convert inactive vitamin D and form it into active vitamin D. So we can activate vitamin D and a bunch of other stuff. But when we're thinking about the kidneys, we're regulating the chemical composition, the volume, pressure of the blood. So lots of stuff all relating to what is inside the blood, how hard it's pushing, all of that good stuff. Okay, so back to more of a macro view of the urinary system. Once we leave the kidneys, that substance that leaves the kidneys is called urine, and then that urine is transported down these tubes called the ureters into the bladder where we store the urine, and then that urine is released in this tube called the urethra. Here's my warning to you that ureter sounds very similar to urethra, but those are different tubes. Both tubes, different tubes. Here's another picture of showing the anatomy of the urinary system. So here we have the kidneys, and then from the kidneys, then we go down the ureters into the bladder and then out the urethra. This picture is showing you that the kidneys are retroperitoneal. So here's the anterior of the body, here's the posterior. We can tell there's a vertebrae there. There's a peritoneal cavity, so all of those like digestive organs, all that good stuff has been removed, and then we have some kidneys there hanging out near the backside. All right, so the rest of this section of the lecture is all about kidneys. So if we were to look at a frontal section of the kidney, this is a right kidney, this is what we would see inside. It has a lot of the same regions as other organs we've learned about so far this semester. So it's covered by a fibrous capsule. So all of this like outer edge is all fibrous capsule, providing a little bit of structure. And notice this shape is much like that of a kidney bean. So that's kind of nice. Just deep to the capsule is the main outer functional part called the renal cortex. So all of this stuff that looks kind of granular, renal cortex. Inside or deep to the cortex is the medulla, renal medulla. So all these triangles are part of the medulla. All of these triangles drain into this like beigey yellowy part, and that is called the renal pelvis, which is continuous with the ureter. The triangles inside of this medullary region, they have a special name. Those are called the renal pyramid in the renal medulla. So we have this triangle shape, this triangle shape. Those are all pyramids, renal pyramids. The pyramids, they look kind of striped because there's lots of tubes in there that are all going towards like apex, the pointy part of this pyramid. Between the pyramids are spaces, like these spaces here, and those spaces are called renal columns, which are just extensions of the cortex. So those renal columns are all part of the cortex. So all of the contents of those renal pyramids, again, they look kind of stripy because they all kind of drain downwards to the apex. They drain into this funnel-like structure. And this funnel-like structure right here, it's kind of like, you know, if you were to drain something into a funnel, that's called the minor calyx. So calyx is the singular. The plural of calyx is calyces. Calyces. One minor calyx, two minor calyces. Okay, so there's two types of calyces. There are small ones, minor ones, and big ones, major calyces. So we have the minor calyx, which will drain into, so we have minor calyx, minor calyx, minor calyx, and all of those drain into this bigger part, which is called the major calyx, just like the bigger portion. All of the major calyces drain into this region here, which is called the renal pelvis. Renal pelvis. And the renal pelvis is just like this big chamber-like bowl part. All this region does is serve as a little like collecting cup for urine, and all of that urine is then passed into the ureter, which is the last thing, and then that's the thing that kind of like helps us leave leave the kidney. And to that point, remember that anything that enters and exits, like that entry and exit point, is the hilum. So let me get my marker here. So this whole region where stuff enters and exits, that's called the hilum. Renal hilum. Where stuff enters and exits. So the cortex appears grainy, appears like dotted, granular, because it's dotted with the functional units of the kidney, which is called a nephron. So the cortex appears granular because it contains the nephron. And by the nephron, I mean like a bunch of nephrons. They're really, really tiny things acting like a little filter, and it's the functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. Um, and again, it performs the function of the kidneys, which is to make sure that the contents of the blood are just right. There's about like 1 million nephrons per kidney. So that's a lot of things to do the kidney thing. So before we look at a picture of a nephron, I'm going to draw you one. So that's what we're going to do on the next slide. So on this slide, we're going to draw the nephron together, and I have my page oriented in landscape, and that's on purpose. So when we're thinking about the nephron, it's really spread out, but in real life, it's kind of like looped back in on itself. We're going to spread it out for simpler at first. So the first part of the nephron kind of reminds me of a Lego hand, and it has a special name. It's called the renal corpuscle. So it kind of goes in like this, just like a Lego hand does, kind of circles back on itself. And if you were to form the wrist of that Lego hand, it would go like this. So this whole portion is called the renal corpuscle. Corpuscle is spelled kind of like how muscle is. Renal corpuscle rhymes with muscle and it's spelled the same. The renal corpuscle consists of this thing called Bowman's capsule, which has an outer part and an inner part. And then inside of Bowman's capsule are these capillaries. And these capillaries are like a ball of yarn. Like that, a ball of yarn. And that ball of yarn is called the glomerulus. Glomerulus. The glomerulus is just a bunch of capillaries. They're super leaky capillaries. So leaky capillaries. In fact, they're fenestrated capillaries. They're fenestrated capillaries, which means that they're pretty leaky. They keep in proteins and cells, but everything else pretty much leaves out of there. How blood gets to those capillaries are this set of blood vessels. So we have an arteriole bringing blood in. So this is an arteriole. That's called the afferent arteriole. Afferent arteriole. And then the blood vessel that leaves is called the efferent arteriole. And I'm drawing the afferent arteriole bigger in diameter than the efferent one on purpose. Efferent arteriole. The reason that the afferent arteriole is bigger to go into this glomerulus is because we want lots of filtration, which means we want lots and lots of fluid leaving into Bowman's capsule. And that substance that leaves into the rest of the nephron, substance that leaves that has a special name, is called filtrate. which is a bunch of stuff. Lots of water, salt, glucose, kind of stuff. Which means then we want lots and lots of pressure to promote the exit of that filtrate. And then as we exit, there's less pressure. So then we go into some tubules. Those tubules, there's a close one and a far one. But both of those tubules are really wonky. They kind of go up and down and up and down like that. And because that tubule looks pretty wonky, we call it and it's close, we call it the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal means close, convoluted means wonky, tubule means tube, so it's close and it's windy. And then we go down into this loop. And that loop is part of the nephron, so we call it the nephron loop. There's a descending part that goes down and an ascending part that goes up, so each of those are named that. So we have the descending limb, the ascending limb. So we have the descending limb, and we have the ascending limb. The descending limb and the ascending limb of the nephron loop also have certain parts of it that are thicker or thinner, and they're named that. So there's a thick segment and a thin segment, but we'll see that on our picture in just a minute that I'm about to show you. So we had a close convoluted tubule, proximal convoluted tubule. We also then have a distal one. So then we have a distal convoluted tubule. So it's called the distal convoluted tubule. In real life, the nephron isn't spread out like this. In real life, this portion, like the first portion of the distal convoluted tubule, or like the last part of the ascending limb of the nephron loop, it actually loops back to travel like right in this space here. So in real life, we're trying to draw a 3D thing in 2D, so that makes it kind of hard. But in real life, this little portion circles back and goes there. So this loops back to travel between the afferent and efferent arteriole. Just so we know. We'll see a picture of that a little bit later. But that distal convoluted tubule then drains into this common tube called the collecting duct. So this is called the collecting duct. And the collecting duct has lots of little branches off of it because it's collecting substances from lots of distal convoluted tubules from other nephrons. From the collecting duct, we drain into the apex of the renal pyramid, which is called the papilla. So then we go into the papilla, renal papilla. I'll zoom in here so we can see. So go from the renal papilla, then that will drain into the funnel-shaped structure called the minor calyx. That will drain into the major calyx. That will drain into the renal pelvis. Then we'll leave the kidney into the ureter. And then from the ureter, then we drain into the bladder, from the bladder out the urethra. So it's really that all of the stuff that the kidney does, which is eventually producing urine, starts at the nephron, and it happens as blood drains into from the afferent arteriole into the glomerulus, this bunch of very leaky fenestrated capillaries. We produce filtrate, and that filtrate travels through the PCT, the proximal convoluted tubule. So you can call this PCT. We travel through the nephron loop. We travel then through the DCT, distal convoluted tubule. We drain that fluid into the collecting duct. That fluid continues to be drained into the renal papilla, into the minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis, then the ureter. Let's take a peek at what this looks like in our textbook. Okay, so here's what we're looking at here. This is figure 25.6 in our book. If we were to look at the cortex and a little bit into that pyramid, this is what we would see. Do you remember I told you that the renal corpuscle, it kind of looks like a Lego hand? Yeah, it kind of does, but it's 3D, okay, kind of more like a ball. So there's that Lego hand structure we were just talking about. There's that ball of yarn capillaries, the glomerulus. We enter our PCT, that's filtrate in there. Then we end up in our nephron loop that we go down the descending limb, up the ascending limb. And remember I told you there was thin parts and thick parts. So there's the thin segment, which is thin, and the thick segment, which is thick. And then we go into our distal convoluted tubule. It's really convoluted. And then we end up in our collecting duct. And remember I told you that the collecting duct receives fluid from lots and lots of different DCTs, distal convoluted tubules. And then eventually this will end up in the renal pelvis, the ureter, and eventually the bladder. Supplying all of that blood to the nephron is really important so that we have enough blood flow to make sure that that filtrate is produced, right? And so if I were to draw a kidney, so here's my kidney that I'll draw. Very simple here. And then we have our ureter coming off of it. There's our ureter, right? So I'm just going to draw one renal pyramid just for easier. There's my one renal pyramid. And remember the renal pyramids, they look striped. And they look striped because down each of those stripes are collecting ducts. So what happens here, I'll draw this in red because I'll talk about the arteries. So what happens is coming into the kidney is the renal artery. So the first thing is the renal artery. We'll zoom in here. Renal artery, A for artery. And then in order to get to the pyramid, then we have the segmental artery. The segmental artery. Then we go up the side of the renal pyramid in between, because the pyramids kind of form like lobes of the kidney. And so we call that the interlobar artery. It goes in between the lobes or in between the pyramids of the kidney. And then we kind of like arch over. That's called the arcuate artery. That's number 4. Arcuate artery. Arcuate means arch-like. From there, number 5 is that we go up. That blood vessel goes up. That's called the cortical radiate artery. And I remember that it's the cortical radiate artery because it radiates out into the cortex. Cortical radiate artery. Radiates out into the cortex, and then from cortical radiate artery, then we get into number 6, which we already know about, thankfully. So number 6 is the afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole, what that does is a reminder is takes blood into the glomerulus. That's the ball of yarn capillaries, the glomerulus. And that promotes filtration. Water and other stuff leaving the blood. So from 6 is 7, which is our glomerulus. And those are fenestrated capillaries. Fenestrated capillaries. And then we exit the glomerulus, and that blood vessel is number 8, which is called the efferent arteriole. Arteriole. The efferent arteriole takes blood away, so we'll write blood leaves. Number 9 are called peritubular capillaries. Peritubular capillaries. Peritubular capillaries really just track along the nephron tubules. Kind of draw them like this. So they follow nephron tubules. Nephron tubules. We have peritubular capillaries that follow those nephron tubules, but a special type of peritubular capillaries, all right, or they can be called vasa recta. Vasa recta are specialized peritubular capillaries that dig deep into the medulla. And I'll show you a picture of that, but that's like within that nephron loop. So I'll show you some pictures of that in just a sec. So we're tracking our blood here. So blood will come in the renal artery, will travel to our renal pyramid and the segmental artery in between the lobes, the interlobar, arch over the pyramid, the arcuate artery, cortical radiate artery, and then we'll do the glomerulus thing, afferent, glomerulus, efferent, and then we have the capillaries. And then as veins, then we just reverse that process. So let me show you what those vasa recta and peritubular capillaries look like. The reason we have different capillaries is because the length of our nephron loop can be long or it can be short. So if that nephron loop is short, we call it a cortical nephron. So having a cortical nephron means that your nephron loop is short. Short nephron loop. Because your nephron loop is short, you kind of like hang out more in the cortex, and then as that nephron loop kind of dips down a little bit to the medulla, but like not really. And I remember I told you all of these tubules are really, really convoluted together. It's not like spread out like we drew it. If your nephron loop goes really far deep into the medulla, as we do here, that is called a juxtamedullary nephron. Juxta means next to, medullary means medulla. So next to the medulla nephron. So that nephron loop is super duper long. Because it's super duper long, then we need specialized capillaries that are also super duper long, tracking that tubule. Those are the vasa recta. And then if you're not a juxtamedullary nephron, if you're a cortical nephron, then you have the peritubular capillaries, just the normal ones. I like this figure from your textbook because it breaks down how blood is supplied to the nephron in both the arteries and the veins. So I like all this. And then this dotted line is talking about the nephron blood supply specifically. So I like that. Now that we know how blood vessels go to supply blood, we know it needs to be readily available, those blood vessels, to help us perform the functions of the kidney. Again, modify the contents of blood. That's what kidney does. But this is also helped by the histology of the nephron, what kind of cells it's made up of. So here we're looking at the nephron. So there's that same picture of the nephron. And then each of these panels are different cell types that make up the different portions. And we're going to circle back to the glomerulus in just a bit. I think talking about the tubules is a better use of our time at this time. So the proximal convoluted tubule, the PCT, all that stuff. These are simple cuboidal. So this is proximal convoluted tubule. That's what we're looking at here. This is simple cuboidal. Epithelium. This is simple cuboidal epithelium. And there's lots and lots of microvilli. I think this is really important to remember because microvilli are structures that drastically increase surface area. So this allows for lots of reabsorbing water. So lots of reabsorbing water and solutes. And reabsorbing here is meaning put back in the blood. Back into blood. From the nephron back into the blood. The nephron loop, it's composed of a thick segment and a thin segment. So that thin segment and thick segment, the thin segment is simple squamous epithelium and the thick is more cuboidal in its shape. But the DCT, the distal convoluted tubule, is much like the PCT, still simple cuboidal epithelium, but it lacks most microvilli, which means we don't need all that surface area because there's less reabsorption that happens here. And then lastly is the collecting duct. That's this one here. The collecting duct consists of two major cell types. There's the principal cells. So there's principal cells. Let me highlight those. Principal cells of the collecting duct. Principal cells are important for maintaining water and sodium balance. So water, sodium balance. And then the other cell type here are called intercalated cells. Intercalated cells are less numerous, but they do have microvilli. And they also maintain a role in acid-base balance in the body. Remember that the collecting duct runs down towards the renal pyramids, and that's why those pyramids appear a bit stripy. And when we do our dissection, we'll be able to see that. And remember that this is a general view of the nephron. In real life, it's not spread out nicely like this. It's really just like looping back on itself. Here's a nice picture from our textbook. This is showing you a section of the PCT. There's a little bit of the DCT here too. So anyways, just so you can look at it if you want to. We are going to pause this video and I'll start a new one to finish up the rest of urinary system anatomy.